So again, welcome everybody for this evening. Oh, that's right, there are tricks to how one speaks to a microphone, apparently. Again, welcome. Cold evening. It's lovely to see so many people. Some of you have not traveled from too far, although some of you have traveled from very far. Most immediately, I think some of you have come from just downstairs from the OTT conference, but having been downstairs, you've also come from very, very far away from around the world. So this event follows the On Think Tanks conference, this year on impact. For those of you that weren't part of the On Think Tanks conference, On Think Tanks is an organization bringing together global think tanks, largely from the Global South. This year was hosted by my institute, the New South Institute, and SAI, the South African Institute of International Affairs, which we held at Gibbs this year. And this is the final concluding session of that conference, focused on state capture. We've had an extraordinary opportunity in that to bring together some of the key players from the Zondo Commission. I'll introduce everyone, but also in particular Daniel Kaufmann, who came out for the OTT conference, who is the originator of the concept with some of his colleagues from the US of the notion of state capture. I think to have this conversation now is, I think, an important one, both for us to be able to reflect on the South African experience, but in relationship to global events. And I think it's especially important to think that relationship now, given what I would regard as a growing authoritarian development internationally, and the increasing relevance of the concept of state capture in understanding a whole range of the features of many countries around the world, and in particular those in the global north. And I think, therefore, it's an opportunity for us in South Africa to reflect on the experience of state capture here, the degree to which we've interrupted it, or perhaps even have even defeated it, but to think about the South African experience in relationship to developments globally and the way in which one might be able to learn from the South African experience to develop strategies to engage it elsewhere in the world. And that's really the opportunity of this event. In particular in South Africa, as I mentioned at the beginning of the OTT conference, we're in a particularly complex but very exciting place in South Africa. And I think, again, we can think of this in relationship to the phenomenon of state capture. Three major developments. In the first place, as of May last year, South Africa had an election where the majority party, which for a long, long time has been regarded as a part of a dominant, at the pinnacle of a dominant party political system, lost the election. It's still the majority party in South Africa, but it is no longer large enough to constitute the majority party in Parliament. So the largest party forced to operate through a government of national unity. What is unusual about the South African situation following that moment, especially given our experience in the post-colonial experience, is that the president of the African National Congress, Cyril Ramaphosa, immediately recognized that election result as a legitimate result, and it marks, for those of you that follow the literature and political science, an incredibly important moment of democratic consolidation. So while the rest of the world, while there's this tremendous authoritarian or populist movement elsewhere in the world, within South Africa, I think we've crossed a fundamental threshold towards democratic consolidation. Our democracy is complex, it is robust, it is by no means perfect, but I think it's past an incredibly important threshold. So that's a very important thing, and I want to ask our panel in relationship to, do they think the events of state capture have contributed to, I think, this profound moment as something positive? So something very positive has happened in that regard in South Africa. There's a second, perhaps not so well known, but I think equally important. For the longest of time, at least for the last 30 years, and historically much longer, the South African state form has been highly politicized in the relationship between the political ruling party and the administration. In South Africa, we fail adequately to instantiate the difference between political office and administrative office after 1994. We deliberately blur that distinction for reasons which I can explain and we can discuss at some point. But nonetheless, we've left the post-apartheid state in a situation where the distinction between political office and administrative office was blurred. I think that's come back to bite us in all sorts of ways in terms of the performance of state institutions, the reliability of state institutions, the effectiveness of state institutions. But currently what is unfolding as we speak now, perhaps not this evening, but over the last several months, over the last year, has been an extraordinary process of state reform. I think it's probably the most important development, one of the most important projects of state reform in the world currently as it exists. Around modernizing the state administration in South Africa Africa, and in particular about instantiating that distinction between political office and administrative office. I think developments in South Africa are historically important. It reminds me a little bit of the way in which Tammany Hall system is dealt with in the US on the 1920s, especially during the Roosevelt period. I think the reforms currently underway in South Africa are as significant, and if we were able to get them through, I think again South Africa it'll transform South Africa. So as complex as the international situation is, on those two fronts at least, there are some very interesting and important developments in South Africa, and I think again they have important lessons for the situation globally. So, on that note, I want to think about, and this is the first challenge for this panel, is to think about these developments in relationship to the Zondo question, to the state capture experience, and in particular to the Zondo Commission, which was the judicial inquiry into state capture in South Africa. What has been the legacy of the State Capture Commission? And does this panel think that state capture in South Africa has been interrupted? And would you like to think about that in relationship to the two issues that I've raised, democratic consolidation and public service reform? Daniel Kaufmann has been doing some incredibly important work around situating state capture contextually and comparatively, and has developed an important index. And it'll be very interesting to think about the South African experience, which I think we have a certain sense of what it means in South Africa, but situated internationally, and see where South Africa fits into the global picture and where state capture looks like where the dramatic developments around state capture are internationally. So we'll move from a South African conversation and situate it internationally. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers. Paul, I'm going to ask you to go first. Paul Pretorius has an illustrious history as a South African lawyer. He's a silk, which in South Africa is the equivalent of a senior barrister in the UK system. Most importantly, and I'm going to summarize a very long and very illustrious career, was the senior counsel for the Zondo Commission, so very involved in leading evidence in the Zondo Commission, and therefore has a very acute and very intimate understanding of the evidence and intimate understanding of the players involved in state capture. So, Paul, you're going to open this up. You're going to tell us a little about the Zondo Commission, and you're going to tell us what your sense is of how the Zondo Commission understood state capture, and your sense of the legacy of that state capture. We're then going to move over to Ferial Haffajee. Ferial Haffajee, again, this is a very illustrious panel for those of you who are not from South Africa. Ferial Haffajee is one of South Africa's most famous journalists, has an illustrious history as an editor of various newspapers, is currently the associate editor of the Daily Maverick, which is South Africa's largest, I think, online news platform. And was very involved in covering the State Capture Commission. Again, knows it intimately, was very involved. Wrote a book which I played a small part in contributing to on the Judicial Commission. So again, has a very intimate knowledge of the Commission itself, and has then been following the work of state capturers since then. We then have Zodwa Xesibe from the Special Investigating Unit, which is one of South Africa's key investigative units in South Africa, a auditor by training, if that's correct. Again with an illustrious history, which perhaps you could share a little bit more with us around the role of the SIU. Again, to see SIU been very much involved in the kinds of investigations which could have or should have or have followed from the State Capture Commission, and we give very interesting understanding of to what extent state capture has been interrupted and to what extent investigations have happened in that space. I know it's a very controversial topic at the moment, especially around the relationship between the findings of the Zondo Commission, of the judicial inquiry, and prosecutions of those involved. And finally, but certainly not least, we're going to Daniel Kaufmann. Daniel Kaufmann is a world-famous economist from the World Bank originally, who played a key role in developing the concept of state capture during his time as the first World Bank appointment to what was then the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Republic of the Ukraine. So watched, had a front row seat, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, saw the capture of the state and produced with Joel Hellman and some others a major World Bank report on the concept. And of course, the idea lands in South Africa in a rather esoteric and unexpected way. Daniel, perhaps you could say a little bit more about your experience after that. But I have, which is notable, and I've come to understand that Wagner is acceptable to listen to because Daniel is also a great connoisseur of opera and a bike rider. So we can hear a little bit about perhaps opera and a Wagnerian perspective on state capture perhaps will be brought in. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Paul to give us a sense of, Paul, your sense of the legacy of the Zondo Commission in South Africa.
Yes, thank you, Ivor. Ivor has given me 10 minutes to describe what was happening in South Africa at the time of the Zondo Commission, and also to describe in that context what is happening now under the head state capture. So I will give you a comprehensive overview of all that in 10 minutes. When the State Capture Commission started, the legal team worked together and presented an opening address to Judge Zondo. And we focused on an essential question. We said, are we dealing, or will we deal with ad hoc, random, disjointed, but many acts of corruption, or are we dealing with a project which organizes this corruption and is led by a group of allied persons who together act to influence state-owned entities and other private and public entities in order to extract wealth from the state for personal and unlawful gain? That was the essential question. And so in investigating and leading evidence on acts of corruption in terms of our quite comprehensive terms of reference, we began to sketch what we thought was and called a big picture. And this is what we came up with in very summary and graphic terms. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see that we came across relationships between and among the private and public sector. The Saxonwold gatherings are well known to all, but essentially private persons in private enterprise, private businesses, allied with people in the public space to construct the project of state capture as was finally concluded by Judge Zondo in his report. That involved appointments and dismissals as high as cabinet. Those that would cooperate in the project were appointed and those that would not were fired. So Barbara Hogan, there was evidence about her being fired and replaced by others who became involved in the state capture project. There were reconstitutions of the boards in state-owned entities, Transnet Board, Denel Board, the Eskom Board, and others. And at executive level, persons were dismissed and replaced over the period of time that state capture took place. Importantly, in the next box, the state-owned entities were reorganized. Procurement entities were, for example, in Transnet, taken from the various divisions and centralized. And state capture appointees were placed in control of those, initially in Transnet and later in Eskom. the same people went from one to the other. Procurement was reorganized, and a pattern developed of relationships between the procurement board, the procurement entities within the state-owned entities, and certain private enterprise entities themselves. And as a result, large amounts of money, billions of rand, was extracted from these state-owned entities, and then there was a very sophisticated system of money flows out of the country. You may have heard of those in recent press reports. That was the pattern of state capture, but importantly, it was directed by people very high up that weren't always visibly linked. That took a lot of research and investigation, visibly linked to what happened there. So you would have the creation of a common purpose series of crimes, corruption patterns, but they weren't always linked to those that executed the scheme, as it were. And that's, of course, one of the difficulties with prosecution. You have, on the one hand, the creation of a common purpose conspiracy to extract money from, for example, state-owned entities, but generally the state. It's executed, but not visibly linked to those that create the conspiracy, and that results in money flows. And often prosecutions now concentrate on the money flows and work backwards, which of course doesn't always work, as we know. But there were many related events in the big picture, or very many circumstances which were also relevant. There was a narrative that supported this whole project. You will know of the New Age newspaper, of ANN7, the television station, the Bell Pottinger narrative that was directly related to this project of state capture. The governing party knew what was happening. In fact, it at one stage held its own inquiry, which didn't get very far. But our president, in his evidence, admitted that he knew what was going on, but couldn't do anything about it, because if he did, he would be marginalized and ultimately unable to do what he did about state capture much later. That evidence is in black and white on the record. And then Parliament. Parliament came under heavy criticism from the judge for failing in its duties of oversight in its various oversight committees and generally. That, thankfully, is different now. So these contextual factors contributed to and allowed what happened in the center of the diagram. The defense, the wall of defense, you remember the Game of Thrones, no doubt, that big snow ice wall that is supposed to defend civilization. That wall of defense crumbled in the years of state capture. Law enforcement agencies were gutted. There was evidence of people within law enforcement agencies actually collaborating in the project of state capture. For just by way of one example, the investigating diary against Bosasa was actually handed to the potential accused implicated in the Bosasa corruption. Then regulatory auditors, both external and internal, also didn't do their work, thus facilitating the whole project of state capture. And of course, the rewards came back to those involved in the first box. A lot of it was in cash. We managed to trace much of it, but unfortunately only scratched at the surface, relatively speaking. So that produced an organized project of state capture. The institutions of state were captured in terms of an organized project to extract wealth in an organized fashion. And so the conclusion on the definition of state capture reached by Judge Zondo was that state capture in the South African context evolved as a project by which a relatively small group of actors, together with their network of collaborators inside and outside of the state, conspired systematically, and that systematically is important, criminally and in defiance of the Constitution, to redirect resources from the state to themselves and others for their own private gain. That is the narrow definition of state capture as evidenced by the Zondo Commission. It doesn't pretend to be a universal definition of state capture, and I'm not sure that such a definition is possible, but I'm happy to be corrected, and I'm sure I will in due course. There is a wider definition of state capture. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which harms the public interest, typically breaching laws, regulations, internal procedures, and integrity standards. But that definition of corruption is so wide as to be of little help to those who are examining the topic. So that's what state capture was all about. I'm sure I've used up more than 5 minutes of my time, but if I may go on. What is important is, and perhaps I've done this slide too early, corruption still exists. We all know it. Throughout the hierarchy of our state institutions, it is rife. It is rife in municipalities, in the provinces, and in the state. Its links go high up. There is no doubt that corruption, the extraction of state resources by organized syndicates, exists to extreme and dangerous levels in our country. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say so. In fact, I'm convinced personally that it's not. And I'm happy to hear any counter views. The question is, we're back to the stage where we were before the Commission. Are we? In other words, are we dealing with disconnected acts of corruption in various municipalities, at various levels of state, in various state-owned entities, in the private sector and in the public sector? Are these disconnected? Are they, to a greater or lesser degree, alternatively, part of an organized project? Where are these syndicates organized? How are they protected? Who is protecting them? And how high up does it go? Now, the reason we can't answer that question is because it's not being investigated at that level. NACAC, the Advisory Committee Anti-Corruption, is advising that systemic corruption be investigated in a new Chapter 9 institution. But it's not being done now. Now, what Zondo recommended was the establishment of a permanent commission to investigate, expose acts of state capture and corruption, and make recommendations in the way that the Zondo Commission did. A permanent commission, properly resourced. At any one stage, the Zondo Commission had up to 100 investigators, plus a team of 20 or so lawyers. If you've ever worked with advocates, you will know that advocates are always right. So the most difficult part of the Commission's work was getting common purpose amongst the advocates. I say that lightly. We worked well together ultimately. But the important, it takes resources. It takes investigators. It takes constant, concentrated work to expose whether and I'm reasonably sure there are, there is organization, syndication behind what we see. One example, you take Tembisa Hospital. There's a syndicate there behind that all. That syndicate hasn't been exposed. People behind that haven't been called to account. There are so many examples. Resource extraction from South Africa, the syndicates haven't been exposed. Where does the coal go? China? I don't know. But the point is that the need for comprehensive investigation and consideration at the hands of a fully resourced and qualified entity is necessary. NACAC is recommending it some 3 years after the Zondo investigation submitted its report. That is quite scary, that we have to wait 3 years before the suggestion is even tabled, let alone put into to action. All right. I just want to say one thing, if I may. The money that was spent on the State Capture Commission, the billion rand, so-called billion rand, wasn't quite that, was more than several times recovered from miscreant private entities.
We will have more opportunity to carry on. Ferial, I'd like you to reflect. I do want to notice one thing, which is interesting, and Paul, you've brought it very strongly to the fore. This understanding in South Africa that state capture really is a form of organized large-scale corruption. This reduction of the idea of state capture to corruption. Now, as you will recall, or perhaps not recall, the work that we originally did around the betrayal of the Promise report, which is work which some colleagues and I did on the first kind of academic study of state capture in South Africa, which played a role in galvanizing a movement in opposition, was to position state capture not simply as a form of corruption, but as a political project. And I know you've used the term a narrative that supported state capture, but it does seem to suggest that this was a narrative which was subservient to a large-scale project of corruption. I'd like us to return to that and think about this relationship between the political character of state capture and the corruption. Ferial, perhaps I know that we've discussed this a lot in the work that we've done together, but please I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ivor. It's lovely to be with all of you. So many, many years ago, I wrote a book called What If There Were No Whites in South Africa? It wasn't a genocidal manifesto at all. But what I was arguing in it was that there'd been a fundamental rupture between apartheid and the years of freedom. And I argued it through the very tangible impacts on many of our lives. That caused me much pain, I have to say, because people both laughed at me, then they cried at me, and then they shouted at me. Because what they were arguing was that there'd been no fundamental rupture between then and the time I was writing. So I bring you the story to say that I fully acknowledge that the apartheid state was one of fundamental capture. So state capture wasn't something new. But what I in fact learned through sitting through 3.5 years with wonderful people like Advocate Paul Pretorius, who led that commission, was that the patterns we were seeing at the commission were neo-colonial and racist in many of their outcomes. So, for example, the Gupta family, who were the family at the center of the story, they assumed that every single black leader they came across was purchasable. And one of the ways in which they were first exposed was when the deputy finance minister, to whom they offered 600 million rand, that's a substantial number in dollars, said no thank you, and he exposed what they were doing. Many people did, however, take their bribes. When you saw how they treated black people, how they shipped in nationals from India to run everything from a dairy farm to their local offices to their payment system, you can see that these were replicable patterns. bigger problem is Bain, McKinsey, SAP, the multinational Swiss port, who were subject to rigorous questioning at the Commission. They came here with a similar purpose, I'd argue. So it fits into the patterns that had been established under previous governments. But what I learned that the Zondo Commission did give us, it was a language with which to understand things beyond beyond the simple definitions of corruption. It was repurposing of institutions, repurposing of the state away from a very positive trajectory, which I had covered for the first, say, maybe 15 years of democracy, where you really did see substantial development as freedom in the way that Amartya Sen has taught it to us. But subsequent to that, I've gone on the road to try and see what's happened to our country. And I bring you a small story of a farm in the Free State, the Vrede Dairy Farm. The first place where the Gupta family bought this farm for a small amount of money. They were given almost 500 million rand. And going back there now was an exercise in sadness, as my husband will tell us. It was a place meant to empower black farmers of the Free State. That's the center of the country. When I last checked, what they had been given was 5 kilograms of meat and a 5,000 rand gift voucher as the government tried to make good after all these years. Absolutely nothing. If you see today, our energy landscape is the biggest thing sitting between South Africans and a better life. Eskom remains fundamentally disabled after all those years. Our electricity prices are through the roof, and in the work I do, people are often having to make choices between food and being able to buy electricity. The reason that our electricity prices are so high is because of what happened at Eskom, which is the big utility that generates electricity in South Africa. At the moment, because of what's happening in the world, because of the Red Sea becoming a no-go zone, we should be benefiting big time from maritime shipping coming through coming at the bottom of Africa. So our ports, Cape Town and Durban, really could be doing great things right now. But because of what happened at the Transnet, which is our big transport system, we can't quickly enough get exports out of the country or accommodate all those ships coming from the Red Sea and using ours as a route. That's because of what happened under the years of state capture. So to wind up, I think it's given us this language for deeper understanding. I think the 3.5 years, they were a theatre of exposure for progressive people who could see the corrosive impacts of corruption to get behind. I think it had the impact of making the patronage networks nervous. But my fundamental, where I find myself now, Ivor, and I wrote about it last week, is I think state capture has multiplied rather than died. And I can talk to you later about some of the places where I see that happening. So I agree with Paul. Huh?
So I think you can... So I deliberately started on an optimistic view from South Africa because I think the internal conversation is rather pessimistic, as one's getting a sense here. Ferial, the question I have for you, though, to think about, and it's similar to Paul's, you called it neo-colonial and racist state capture, and yet it's largely facilitated by a ruling party that comes to power through a liberation struggle against a racist colonial system. So there's a question around, you would have to explain, how is it that a liberation party permits and facilitates what you're calling a neo-colonial and racist system? So don't answer that now, but let's return to those sorts of questions in a moment. Zodwa Xesibe from the SIU, we've heard some rather pessimistic views from a legal and journalistic view. What is the view from investigations? And I know you're not involved in prosecutions, but what is the situation from investigations?
Thank you. Good evening to you all. Maybe let me start off by expanding on the definition. The Zondo definition of state capture, it defined it as a project. It evolved as a project. But I'm just tempted to think that had it not been the media, had it not been the former public protector who exposed this state capture in South Africa, it could have been maybe today the real state capture. Maybe would have ticked all the boxes by now. Would be sitting in the dark because we were on a decline. Having said this, the Zondo Commission and all the work that was done, I think it laid a very complex, but it is a big foundation for the reforms in the country. From the SIU perspective, we had all these proclamations. We had all these individual pockets of proclamations that we were investigating, and ESCOM, Transnet, the NEL, human settlements, but it gave us an opportunity to sit down and say, hang on, there's a bigger picture here. There are similar role players. And we started off by forming a committee that then would assist us in identifying what is happening here, who are the key people, who's at the engine of all of this corruption. But not just at an SIU level. We looked now at other entities. How can we collaborate as a country, especially in the law enforcement? And then we started engaging even more, and we started discussing a number of things, and then that collaboration, I know it may be seen to be taking longer, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I was pleased today, we were appearing before SCOPA, all three entities. It was AFU, it was NPA, it was IDEC, it was SIU. We were all discussing the cases that we normally refer for prosecution, and most of them are the cases relating to state capture. There was some kind of admission from our side that, yes, these matters may have taken long because the complexity, we never anticipated that there would be so much a systemic corruption in South Africa. And that it is helping us to now come up with new strategies. How do we then look at digitizing our environment? How do we then involve analytics in our investigative processes? How do we get all these skills that we never thought of in the past? So for us, I think it's really we really have learned a lot from the Zondo Commission and its recommendation. We've taken the recommendation, and as a country, I cannot then say it's all bad, because the report from the presidency, I'm going to be reporting this because we are part of the task team. The report in May, we were pleased that at least in terms of the commitments by the president on all the mechanisms to address the state capture, we are sitting at 63%, which for us it's a very good progress. And obviously those areas where we are not really achieving much are the areas relating to really legislative reforms and some of the complex matters. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Can I Can I just remind, we have a very large online audience, which I'm very pleased to announce. Also, this audience as well, we have many people from all around the world. To those who are speaking, can you explain some of the terms, the translated, an ESCOM, what they are, when you're talking, when one's mentioning various state apparatuses? Can one just describe what they are so that our audience can understand them better? So I think that's a positive view. I'm not sure. 63% of your investigations are?
No, it's 63%. Remember, the president committed. Okay, so I'm being. The president committed to a number of mechanisms to address the recommendations of the state capture report, and then part of then that progress, we are sitting at 63%. I'm not talking about SIU. From the asset recovery, remember SIU, we are, the Special Investigating Unit, the Republic of South African Special Investigating Unit. From our side, if you can just go to slide 17, whoever is driving the slides. Okay, so I think it's just want to present that positive view. Between us and the AFU, we have already achieved the results as depicted in the table. The potential cash or assets to be recovered, those would be restraints and preservation orders already that have been issued at 17.7 billion. Then the actual cash, which is now we're talking forfeitures, settlements, and confiscations, we are sitting at 10.9 billion out of the state capture funds only. And then the contracts and administrative decisions that are set aside, we are sitting at 9.2 billion. We've prevented losses as well. And then we still have matters that are still at the special tribunal, the SIU special tribunal, and for those matters alone, we have 64 billion rand worth of matters that are at the special tribunal. We've referred 86 matters to the National Prosecuting Authority. Obviously, the disciplinary referrals, we are thin because most of the state capture perpetrators, they left the employ of the state institutions. We have, we've got what we call administrative referrals. This is where we now identify the key role players, the companies, the directors, the boards. We have now referred them for delinquency and so forth to the CIPC and other regulatory bodies. So that's just a picture of what we have done. I think we have done some work, and I think we are not celebrating some of these outcomes a lot, and it's something that we have to do. Then the prosecution process is still ongoing, but there are also convictions there, and I think they would come and report. Yes, there are things that we need to touch on, especially as way forward, and really it's a question of looking at who gets appointed in key positions, and that will be slide number 19. Okay, we've got these are our based on our observations. I didn't want to take through my whole presentation, it's a bit long, but based on our observation, we are recommending some kind of institutional independence, and we want to emphasize on the merit-based appointments, because people were appointed in position, they never possessed any skills, but because there was a group of individuals who had that mandate, I think the council, SC has already spoken about the appointments of boards. At the time, the boards were appointed at a certain point, by external people who are not members of the government. And then the list will then be presented to ministers for them to appoint. So that's why I'm still arguing that had it not been the media, had it not been the noise that was made, would be in a very worse situation. So we are actually looking at all of those, like, strengthening oversight and accountability, public sector reforms, transparency to access and access to information. So these are then the proposals, just like at a global view by the SIU based on our observations alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a slightly mixed image, some pessimism on the one side, and yet there's a sense that there's some progress. Daniel, I want to ask you to come in here and give us a sense of how South Africa relates to developments internationally on the basis of some of the new work that you've been doing, and perhaps you would share with us a little bit about the index that you've developed and what you're seeing as in terms of global trends.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you and to collaborate again. I had the honor of being here in a small role as an expert witness and collaborated with Joel Hellman, with whom I collaborated when we started all this work many years ago, but during the Zondo Commission, where you were the lead prosecutor. So I'll try to give a little bit of the global perspective, including with the data and the empirics, because it's fascinating to hear you all. And there is a big question about the glass half full, the glass half empty, where are we going? And it is my experience in general, especially on this type of topics, whichever country I go to, there is a tendency to think that we are the worst, right? And corruption is through the roof and so on. So sometimes it is useful to put it in comparative empirical perspective. So without further ado, I'll do it. I'll go pretty fast because I'm very interested in the interactive part, but I promise that I'll be transparent about it. Anybody who is interested, I'll share this. This is just very quickly back to the future. And when we started the work with Joel Hellman, we felt very, very strongly we cannot just talk words and prose. We have to measure it. So we did a survey of the former Soviet Union. That's where we were focused. And and this goes to show that not always is a question of the glass half full or half empty. It can be really full or relatively empty, A, and B, the extent of state capture can vary enormously across countries. It's not that we all have the same issue. And it is interesting in retrospect, and poignantly so. We're talking about 2000, 1999, 2000, to see where Hungary was with relatively absent state capture, going through their transition from communism, socialism to a more market-based economy. Estonia was equally low, compared with Russia, Azerbaijan, and a number of others who showed extremely high capture in the measure. Hungary has gone a very different way. We're going to see it very soon. Estonia, other Baltics, and a few other countries have done relatively well in avoiding state capture throughout. So what were we talking about in terms of state capture? And this is, to put it in a broader context, the fascinating discussion you just had as to how you approach it, how you view it, how you defined it. And I think there are many similarities and overlap and some broader issues, but each country has its own context, so that's right. So we started by viewing it in a contrasting way to the traditional approach to corruption. The traditional notion of administrative corruption at the time, we're talking in late 90s and so on, was the fact that there were particular acts illegal in the implementation of the set or preset rules of the game, as opposed to state capture, which was a very different type of notion, we thought, because it it related to the shaping of the rules of the game, including the institutions, the budget, as discussed, by the economic and politically very influential at the expense of the public good. The focus then that we try to do is to shift away from always focusing on a corrupt middle-level public servant to the economic and politically influential captor, that it can be a very powerful non-state actor, and a number were mentioned in the case of here, can be a politician, or very often, and very increasingly often nowadays, it's both sides colluding. State capture, a lot that happens in state capture can be legal, and it's here, it's up to the experts here in state to say how much was done within the law, how much extra legally. And this is by design, because, and it can be legal even if far from ethical, but why can it be legal? Because if the captors are engaged in shaping the rules of the game, they're going to shape, morph, and distort the law to avoid legal jeopardy and so on. And that's what happens in many countries. And that's a significant difference from the traditional approach to corruption that tended to be viewed, and particularly by the legal profession, as a strictly legal act from the get-go. So I think we need to keep that in mind. This is very much related and has come up to acute inequality of influence by the few potentates. We will come back to that. And it's a fundamental driver of major socioeconomic and political outcomes. You have exemplified that already here in the case of South Africa. And that's different than corruption, that very often is a symptom of more fundamental causes, where inequality of influence and capture plays a role. And that led also to a bit of a rethink of the definition of corruption, and that came up already. Paul and others mentioned it. And instead of focusing so much of the abuse of public office for private gain, which is a conventional definition of corruption, for provocation, I suggested, why don't we think about instead the privatization of policy and polity? So, and the process that's all involved, but in much more, much broader terms, which can be legal. So then recently, the issue became more and more prominent, and one of the big roles that was played in the issue of state capture becoming more prominent is a very practical application and redefinition that was done here in South Africa, where instead of calling it traditional corruption, all was seen through the lens of state capture. I thought it would be worthwhile to have an initial effort to try to measure it globally and comparatively on time and in space across countries. I don't have the time now, but trust me, in terms of the methodology, using external data sources, I don't make any assessment of a particular country. We use external sources, and I want to showcase just a few results. One of the first things that comes through in this measure that was just developed in the last year with data up to 2022 is the insight that when you try to measure state capture, it's from a measurement perspective, empirical perspective, what comes out is not the same as the traditional corruption measures that we have been seeing and using for already 25 to 30 years. There are countries where both are very low, relatively low, the Nordics, for instance. But then there are countries where there are very significant differences, and many of them, and a few of them, one is the United States, the other, it's my own country, Chile, where we tend to say that we may be more captured than corrupt. So the levels of traditional corruption may not be that high, but the level of capture may be much higher. And that's also has been traditionally the case, according to the data, already for many years in the United States, which we will revisit in a bit. Spain, and especially Greece, are interesting cases where it's the other way around, where it doesn't work It's not captured really, but it's more decentralized and disorganized type of corruption. If we bring this closer to here, just for comparison, it is interesting to see that by 2022, which is the latest data we have, so we don't have it until today, in the case of South Africa, which is, again, to put it in perspective, doesn't come out enormously high, but it's not very low either, but it's very similar in terms of the levels of traditional corruption and the levels of state capture. That's what the data said. Look, by contrast, the DRC is extremely high, and Russia, on the other hand, but in the case of Russia, Turkey, Hungary, much more basically captured than traditionally corrupt. It is interesting to see that South Africa, Senegal, Ghana are similar levels, Botswana a bit lower. Now, when we aggregate all this data together, an interesting insight comes through that by not having measured state capture, by not having paid enough attention, we have done a disservice in terms of exposing the extent of the governance challenge in the rich world, in the more developed world, where the traditional measures of corruption often did not really capture the essence of the governance issue, because it's not always the typical bribe and so on, but it's through means more legal in some cases and so on. So we see on the left, for high-income countries, if we compare in the same scale the traditional corruption index with the state capture index, all of a sudden, the West, the industrialized rich countries, doesn't look that good, which is consistent with some of the countries I showed before. While it's a little bit of the opposite for the lower and middle income countries. Just very quickly, to see evolutions over time, and to put also the South Africa in comparative perspective, in Africa in this case, and I'll show a bit more data after that, but this is interesting to see that the data does show a spike, not huge, but there is an evolution basically over time, and you can map it to particular administrations. And in recent years, it does show, at least until 2022, a bit of a reversal of state capture, a bit of an improvement. But again, it's not as it is an extremely low level. It's interesting to note that Senegal used to be doing much better 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago than South Africa. Now it's reversed because also the problems, recent problems in Senegal. While Uganda, of course, it's at a completely different level, and Botswana is doing a bit better. We take it to the Americas, to a completely different part of the world, and I include my own country, Chile, but you can see the red is the US. And one can see that there has been a problem until 2022. So we're not speaking about the current situation, but up to 2022, a very significant increase for about 15 years, from 2005, surpassing the levels of Chile. This is not extremely high, it's all relative and so on, so the scale only goes to 40. As opposed to an unsung success case in the Americas, which is one country very close to Chile, which is Uruguay, which, if anything, is gone in the different direction. For benchmarking, I added Norway, which is obviously at a much different level. But this was relative, and it was the scale, I put it in the previous graph, only up to 40. Now I have to expand it up to 100, just to show that there are countries where fuller capture has taken hold, and in a very dramatic way. But it's one country, and it can show that, yes, it can be done, like in South Africa, there's been a bit of a reversal. In Ukraine, basically evolves exactly like Russia since the Soviet Union collapses until about 2011, 2012, 2013, And then in Ukraine, there has been an improvement ever since, which is a blue line as opposed to the red line. Hungary, Turkey, incredibly increases. So there's nothing predetermined here. One can go in very different directions. There can be reversals and so on. Very quickly before concluding, and to put it in the context that Paul brilliantly put your slide of how it worked in South Africa, a comment about scope from a general comparative perspective. State capture can be so systemic and so broad. So the 5 broad pillars, which are crucial, and I think in the case of South Africa, you touch about 4 of them. One is about the constitutional rule of law institutions, the parliament, the high court, the intelligence services, and so on. The second key pillar is the economic policy administrative pillars, the public finances, including the budget, the central bank, civil service, the regulatory agencies, and so on. Third, the dismantling of the whole anti-corruption, anti-money laundering framework in terms of the norms, the regulations, the norms of it. The fourth, there is a very important aspect which was mentioned also, which is the cultural and informational, which includes the capture of the media. AI nowadays is very important, the capture of the narrative. There is a very important cognitive aspect which we can discuss further. And fifth, last but not least, and that's playing a role nowadays, as we know, globally, is the transnational element, which was not a big issue for South Africa, but we know nowadays is crucial. And that has also a sectoral element. So what's happening around natural resources, what's happening in terms of international finance, in terms of the trade, in terms of the trade barriers and the tariffs, and so on, is a case in point. The discussion around Greenland, around Ukraine, and so on. So this is to illustrate that there's something incredibly systemic, strategic. It may appear to be disorderly in terms of implementation, but there is a grand plan, usually, and as you put it very clearly. This has enormous consequences, which I don't have the time or the space to go through them, but we're talking about huge socioeconomic and development costs. You just talk about electricity, about Transnet. In other settings, the health system, education system can collapse. And this is likely a multiple of the cost of traditional corruption, which is by construction, because we're not talking about getting around a regulation, a transaction that is corrupt and so on. We're talking about the total reshaping of the norms, the rules of the game for the benefit of the few. So we're talking about multiples in terms of the cost for society than the typical corruption. And we know now also about the undermining of civil and political rights. So in sum, we suggested that we need to move, and nowadays even more so, from the notions of traditional corruption and templates. State capture is crucial to assess fundamentals and not the symptoms, and it can be very systemic and broad, as you have written about it. We haven't spoken enough, and it comes out so clearly from the data, how crucial prevention is now. There's very little, frankly, particularly in the short to medium term, that can be done in a country which is fully captured or almost fully captured. I think my sense in South Africa, whether the glass is half full or half empty, you have an enormous opportunity to continue working on these and making a difference, because you're so far, and we saw it in the data, from those countries that are fully captured. So it is possible to do if one can engage in prevention, because like in the health systems, prevention is much less costly than the cure. So that's very important, but of course timely identification, the use of data, collective action, and not resting on the laurels. We cannot conclude that we are done yet. The in-country diagnostic in each case is crucial because it will elicit very important differences from one setting to the other. Nobody should come from outside and say, because we have the data, this is what you have to do. This has to be done here through an in-depth diagnostic. You all did it, including you with your colleagues and, and Paul and others. And that has to be done periodically to understand what are still the vulnerabilities. Are there still vulnerabilities in the judiciary, in the police, in parliament, conflicts of interest in government still, which can lead to more capture? At the same time, to understand what are the current strengths. You spoke about it in terms of also the media and citizens, civil society, and think tanks, which are crucial in this. And who are the agents of change in the executive and judicial and legislative? Because there's no government is monolithic or group of that. And what are the points of entry? And to finish, I think in this issue, one doesn't win popularity contest. So audacity is needed in exposing, addressing state capture, and I know you took many risks in that, and evidence is absolutely crucial. We just came out from 2 fantastic days on think tanks and so on. There's a big debate and controversy whether data and evidence matters or can make the difference. I like to put it unambiguously. And these issues, this is absolutely crucial to collect the evidence, to have the data, the comparative the data, and to use the power of data to influence a policy. All the resources are in this website in terms of the index and the explanations and so on. And this is just to show that data matters. This type of work and this data has been picked up by The Economist, by the Financial Times, and so on. And those begin to make a difference. Not the whole difference alone. Data has to be complemented by the agents of change, by the champions of reform, and so on. But I like to put to rest the notion that nowadays, because we are in the fake news world and the post-fact world, data matters much less. To the contrary, we have to double down, and it matters even more than ever. Thank you.
I want to open this up to everyone. Fantastic presentations, great provocation from Daniel. I have to say, it resonates with my sense that there's some very positive developments, democratic consolidation, a grand project of state reform, and it looks like we did interrupt, perhaps maybe not defeated, but we have interrupted state capture in the sense of an organized system of changing the rules of the game to benefit a small elite minority. And that maybe what we're seeing now is the interruption of state capture, and now we're seeing mass decentralized corruption. And we need to understand that relationship. I know the NSI, the New South Institute, is doing a lot of work on elite dynamics. And one of the suggestions which we're making in a new report that will come out shortly is around decentralizing of elite contestation and its relationship to corruption. The way I'd like to do this is I'm going to open up to the floor. But first of all, I'd like the panelists to have a chance to engage each other, or ask each other questions, or points of clarification if there are any, or perhaps points of disagreement around what they've said and what they've heard. Okay. So we're going to go straight to the audience. We have a question from colleagues in Eastern Europe who've asked the panel generally. A very impressive civil society movement that emerged in South Africa. What lessons does it have for others around the world around interrupting state capture in other parts of the world? So perhaps we can take that as the first question. Sir, I saw your hand. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello. I'm Pradeep Mehta from Kutch in India. In fact, in a group discussion that we had, one of the goals that was suggested was that the civil society think tank should work on corruption. It's an issue which is becoming more and more endemic as well as debilitating. Now, the question that I wanted to ask the panel, and you also, that, we are also looking at state capture of think tanks and media, and not just corruption alone. That may not be corruption. It happens in many countries. They twist the elbows of think tanks, NGOs, threaten them with deregistration and so on if they don't comply with the state's views or if they are too critical. Now, that is something which is worrisome to a lot of think tanks and civil society groups. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. Sonia Stojanovic, guys from Serbia, really learned a lot from South Africa and been speaking about the case everywhere. The question I have, and it's briefly touched by Daniel in his presentation, is how much do you think geopolitical competition is now facilitating or pushing towards state capture? And, if you were to capture now South Africa, would you play that card, or would you still play the politics of? They have to be localized, but I'm just wondering this interplay between domestic and international, besides the intermediaries that you all mentioned, McKinsey and agencies and so on. But more politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, sir.
Thank you very
Could you
much.
introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Manyosi. I'm a South African, just in brief. Maybe by background, I've been a mayor of a city and blah, blah, and a member of parliament. So I might be a target of state capture investigation by Paul. But thank you very much. I think the points made are very crucial. And I like the concluding remarks of Paul, that perhaps we have just entered into a more aggressive phase of state capture. I think that is very telling. Now, if there were to be a further leg of inquiry into the state capture, as per your recommendation on permanent commission, would it be ideal to investigate in a sober sense? Because I think there was a lot of noise around the state capture commission as it was happening in South Africa. It did not have an opportunity to delve into issues in a much more objective way, not attacking the integrity, but to say people that should have come forward, that we should hear their side of the story, were not given that opportunity because a political party, what you call, muzzled them. It prevented them from coming. They were selecting who should be at the state capture and who should not be at the state capture. So it was more of an internal political battle. But I'm not in any way casting doubt on the extent to which we are able to expose the good work. So my question is, would it be ideal that you should perhaps investigate the dependence of the corporate sector on the state, and the state on its dependence on the corporate sector, in terms of provisioning of services? Because I think that is the biggest source of conflict in terms of competition for opportunities. And the one who is in the state will be able to dish out favors, either by being an internal agent to issue out inside information, what do you call it? Inside trader information kind of a thing, that kind of a thing. So I think that should be investigated so that we're able to distill the relationship between role players in society. Everyone is important, just as it is between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. So as well, the corporate, the state, there must be a distillation of the relationship. And the relationship of public holders, public office holders to the corporate sector, because that's where the problem, in my view, emerges. That the corporate captures me as a politician so that I should have influence on the state, so that through me, they can achieve their objective in terms of competition in the market spaces and so on and so on.
Okay, I think that's a nice opening session. I think let's discuss this not as kind of an expert panel and an audience. Let's open this up. We've got some outstanding people sitting over there on that side. amongst the audience. So let's, if some of you want to share experiences or engage with other people's answers, please feel free to. Let's start the other way. Daniel, do you want to answer some of those questions? We've got 3, so take your pick, around 4.
No, obviously, and I'll be very interested in your view from the South African perspective, but your point about geopolitical competition is very important. Of course, and that could be a whole different and session, and we could be until midnight. Geopolitical competition has existed for a very long time. So the form, the manner, and it matters enormously, and we could make the case that a tipping point has taken place in recent months, and this type of geopolitical competition is much more amenable, or the risk increases much more highly that there is this type of state capture. And that's why I feel it's very important that 5th dimension that I put there in terms of the different pillars of state capture. There is a transnational dimension, which if there is that element from the US, that's not that new. I mean, what we have seen for the past 15 years in terms of Russia versus Ukraine, even before the invasion, there was elements and the infiltration too. You know that much better. So there are case studies at the transnational level because of these geopolitical competitions that will be very interesting. But the case can be made very compellingly that risk is increasing enormously now. And it is related to some particular sectors and the critical minerals issues and so on that we have to be very mindful to. In that, and I know it's a sensitive issue, but the racial element is not only here, okay? And that's playing a role also geopolitically in an international level, which we can discuss over drinks as to how this is playing out, but I'm sure you're being. So that is a very important element in this context. Related to your very good question about medias, NGOs, and so on. One of the reasons we have expanded the notions and so on, when we started the work on state capture with Joel, the focus was on the oligarchs. And by the way, we didn't invent this issue. You know who invented it? Aristoteles. Aristoteles coined the term oligarchy with a K and a Y, right? So it's started from that. But that was the focus, the oligarchs in Russia and so on. And that was were the key captors. Over time, it has evolved, and as you said, to include many other actors. Very important actors are political parties in some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe. They play a very, very important role. Politicians, but also the state leader in many places becomes one of the main captors. But let's not underestimate, it's not always the same damage that can happen to institutions of the media and NGOs. There are some from Latin America here, a colleague from Chile, and so on. We have an expression in Spanish. NGOs, basically in Spanish, is ONGs, Organizaciones No Gubernamentales. We say OMGs, Organizaciones Muy Gubernamentales. Okay, very governmental organization. Or the Gongos, I guess, sometimes they're called. Yeah, the Gongos. So the issue is real. In some cases, and that's also, I know, politically incorrect to say, in some countries, we have a problem with associations. Associations of teachers in some countries oppose major educational reform because they're against their vested interest and so on. So this is not an ideological issue of the left or the right. In that case, we see it even in the case of Chile and other countries. It can happen under left of center administrations, under right of center administration, and so on. So it's not an ideologically loaded issue that sometimes it's tended to be. And nobody, no type of actor should be immune from being seen as being engaging in state capture. But the others.
Zodwa, would you like to respond? I think the experience of the institution of the SIU is unusual internationally. Perhaps would you like to respond to some of the questions around, especially around the way in which other countries might learn from the way in which South Africa has tackled it?
Okay, no, thank you. You know, I forgot to introduce my colleague. I've got my colleague here, Mr. Masilela. He's sitting right there. He's a member of the Special Investigating Unit, as well as somebody who was involved as an investigator in the State Capture Commission. Maybe I should have just taken the audience through my entire presentation, but I think time was not on our side. From the SIU, we only investigate matters that are proclaimed by the president. So our investigations are allegation-based. We receive allegation from the public, and then we motivate for a proclamation based on the allegations that we receive, and then we submit it to the Department of Justice. Then it gets submitted to the presidency, and then the president then publish and issues a proclamation for us to investigate. We only investigate matters that involved state institutions, and our main mandate is to recover ill-gotten funds. So ours is more on the asset recovery side. So that's basically it. And then from this, I've just presented an overview of our outcomes, what we've achieved so far, and you would have noticed that it's mainly the recovery side. We've got our sister entity, Asset Forfeiture Unit, that is currently housed at the National Prosecuting Authority. We work together in some of the matters, and in some we work alone. So we've got our own court, the Special Tribunal, and our matters are adjudicated at the Special Tribunal. Maybe just to attempt to address the question from our former mayor. I know it was, I think you were asking the SC about it. But I think from the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, the president has appointed the National Advisory Council on the anti-corruption. It's NACEC. National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. So as part of their recommendations, I think they've come up with 14 recommendations, and then as part of their recommendation, they've got what we call public participation. So it's going, they are recommending this entity that will then also deal with, act as a commission, as a permanent commission, and deal with matters directly that will be addressed by the public. I'm not sure whether that will address specifically your concern, but I know that commissions can be very expensive. I'm not sure whether it will be in the it will get any favor in terms of now establishing another commission. I'll pause there, Program Director.
Thank you. Ferial?
Okay. To the geopolitical question. So something that's an inconvenient truth is that Rosatom, the Russian nuclear company, as well as the Chinese rail company, they were at the center of the story. And trying to get any kind of compensation or justice around that, I think, is difficult because we are now part of the BRICS Plus, and so geopolitics overshadows perhaps the work that should be done there in thinking about it. And then specifically on your story of the corporates is we chose to enter deferred prosecution agreements with McKinsey Bain and others, for very good and rational reasons. But what I have found is that it gives them a get-out-of-jail-free card. And so until recently, McKinsey was a co-sponsor of the Business 20. You know, we've got the G20 coming up. And it was the presidency which had to step in and say, we don't think they should sponsor this. They can so easily launder their reputations and continue business as usual that I wonder if they've thought deeply and reflectively enough of the damage that they caused at many of our key institutions.
Three issues. One, the comment about the independence of the State Capture Commission. It certainly was independent of state control, and one feature that allowed it to do its work was the fact that we are a constitutionally protected society where the executive would have been, had it tried to interfere, prevented from doing so. So it was independent of state and executive control. The fact that it made controversial decisions in addressing its terms of reference is a matter of record, and these issues will be canvassed in at least a dozen reviews, court reviews of the findings of the Commission in an attempt to set all or part of them aside. That will be explored by our independent judiciary. The multinational aspect, I'll only mention that many leading multinational corporations sought to exploit the vulnerabilities in South Africa by forming links with corrupt actors, state capture actors in South Africa, causing great harm to our state-owned entities, electricity, transport, our tax collection entity, and the like. And we're still suffering the consequences of that. Whether the international multinationals have been properly called to account, I agree that's a controversial issue. I just want to mention one feature of our society that is historically very important. It's been mentioned that the media, academia, they caused all the trouble about exposing state capture and the state's complicity in state capture over many years, which created in turn a public pressure, which created in turn the appointment of the State Capture Commission. Civil society in our country is, I would say, one of the most positive aspects of our society, whether they're non-governmental organizations. The media plays a vital role in our society, protected as it is by the Constitution and by our courts. Many of the investigations into corruption, high-level corruption, have been and continue to be conducted by our investigative media, who are doing a fantastic job. So civil society, historically in this country, even in the apartheid days, was extremely active and continues to be active. And that's a very positive feature of our society, which has contributed to the identification and fight against corruption and state capture.
Thank you. We have some online questions, very specific questions, but I want to be guided by the time. I know we're competing. The sooner we end, we can return. We can go to a cocktails dinner. I think NSI sponsored and SAI sponsored with the T20. So I don't want to keep us for much longer. So we can go and have some drinks and mingle with others that are here. But I do want an opportunity for another round, perhaps a short last round. Yes, ma'am. Then will you introduce yourself, and then yourself, ma'am.
A think tank based here called Zeni Sustainable Finance. So I had a question about violence and also the connection then, so state capture, corruption and organized crime. if those connections have been made at all, and if violence or the threat of violence in the process of state capture makes things worse in any way, if that's been studied or considered. And also I see that the US and South Africa seem to be positioned on the same level in the index, more or less. And just wanted to understand, it would be interesting to see the sort of the lived, I don't necessarily think that the state capture conversation in the US is similar to here. And if there's been, maybe, but in terms of lived experience, perhaps it is, and if there's been some research around that, in terms of sort of the lived experience of citizens in those countries, in terms of the implications of, or impacts of state capture. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Karine Foster. I'm South African and I work in education development. I have a rather basic question, and that is what, looking at those different countries, very interesting to see which countries land where, and I'm trying to see a pattern in terms of what makes a country vulnerable to state capture. Is it economic status? Doesn't look like it when you look at the comparison. Is it certain political systems? Or what is it? And then what are safeguards against state capture? You mentioned the media, maybe a strong civil society or legal system, but what would you say in terms of those two, the threat and then some safeguards in terms of state capture?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Will you introduce yourself?
I'm a researcher based here at the Research Institute here based in Johannesburg. I also did some work at the Zondo Commission. I just wanted to ask Daniel Kaufmann a question about the so the project that was identified as state capture in the South African context was couched in a kind of, as Ivor mentioned, in a political project. But the project was very overtly kind of couched in language about the kind of a subversion of the state, subversion of the political order, of the constitutional order, for instance. So I just wanted to know, in your experience on looking at other examples of state capture, were there, you did mention about the narratives, like the importance of narrative construction around these projects, but are there other examples that we can look at where there was this kind of explicit, subversion or explicit kind of attempt to subvert the political order or the constitutional order in some of the other experiences you looked at?
Should we take? Oh, I can see there's more. So people are willing to defer on cocktails. That's fine. So, ma'am, will you introduce yourself?
Hello, hear me? Hi, I'm Shingai. I'm from the Enhancing Accountability Technical Assistance Facility, long name, EU funded. Thank you so much for the presentations, by the way. Just a question. I think the state capture project is defined, is not really a thing of the past. I think those were some of the initial reactions. And I'm just wondering, from the South African context, just your question as well, what are the safeguards in place? Because I don't think there's the fear of, if given an opportunity, it could be manufactured, it could be a 2.0 state capture project. And I'm just wondering, where we're going with this, being forward-looking and what it means, institutionally and just even the role of civil society.
Super. Please, and will you introduce yourself?
My name is Jabo Masilela. I'm from the Special Investigating Unit. Thank you so much for the presentations. They were very informative, really insightful as well. Mine is to Mr. Daniel. I just wanted to, it also touches on the colleague's question. I wanted to understand from the research or the study you've done, did you identify what other countries are doing correctly, to prevent the capture to happen? If you look at your graphical presentation, there were countries like Norway where, if you compare them to the other countries, they appear to be some sort of outliers. So I just wanted to understand whether we did also go deep to understand what is it that they were doing correctly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we're going to take that round and then close off to this evening. Thank you very much. I want to some final remarks I'll make at the end. Can we take that as to the all panelists around the questions around what kind of instruments or efforts are needed in order to interrupt or stop or prevent state capture? And this was the question, one of the spirit of the questions that have come online as well. So, in that, can we start with you, Ferial?
So I'd like to answer your question first. In the Zondo Commission, I found that the psychological and institutional violence exercised against whistleblowers was enormous. Many of them have been unable to find jobs. Many of them have been really harmed by the bravery of the action. One of them, Athol Williams, who blew the whistle on Bain, had to leave the country. But as I study local capture now, you'll notice that there's a lot of by-elections at the municipal level. Many ward councillors are being killed in hits because of, I think, the local form of capture we're seeing. So it's morphed out of this psychological or institutional violence to physical violence because the stakes are much higher, and it's become much easier to hire hit people, hit men usually. So I am beginning to at least try and track and study that local level. And then I suppose the word I love from Daniel is audacity as a mechanism of opposing capture, and it's not something that we are in short supply of here, thank God.
The question of violence was raised, which is endemic in our society at present. Apparently, and I stress the word apparently, corruption has become fragmented. The concept has been raised already. And in a way, disparate and dissolute in the sense that it's not centrally organized in the same way that state capture examined by the Zondo Commission was. The question is that correct? Or is there still central organization? And that question can only be answered on proper investigation and examination. But what has happened between state capture under Zondo Commission and now is the enforcement of corrupt intent and execution through violence and assassinations. And it's a serious problem in this country, really serious.
Thank you. I think I will also add on the issue of violence. We cannot run away from the fact that what is happening at Tembisa Hospital can be regarded as a state capture. And we lost a life there, which is sad. And we've lost many of our witnesses, and most of them, the reason that we are not really making strides in getting the process of prosecuting some of the state capture enablers, it's because most witnesses are very scared. They are very scared to come forward. Even those that testified in the commission. But now when it comes to then the testimony in court, they are really terrified. So we cannot really run away from the fact that there is a link between the violence and the issues relating to state capture. And then there was a question now on what needs to be done. From a country's perspective, I've already alluded to the fact that from the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, the presidency, he came up with a number of mechanisms, and most of them was mainly to strengthen our state institutions, especially the law enforcement agencies. And by way of strengthening them, it's through the appointment of the merit-based people in positions, in key positions, and to get rid of all the people that were part of then the enablers of the state capture. Some of the mechanism is to come up with preventative measures, systemic systemic investigations. There are a lot of them, and then also asset recovery. And what is very good in terms of fighting corruption is to really take away the money, and at least that one, they can't even fight you, the state, using the same money that they stole from the same government. So we are at least, trying our level best to do that as the Special Investigating Unit. There are a number of measures, and I think we've got about 100 mechanisms that the president really outlined, and then out of those are where I was saying we are sitting at 63% in terms of completion rate. Thank you.
Daniel, do you want to bring us to an end?
You will bring it to an end, but I'll be brief because the drinks are waiting, and I cannot do therefore full justice to the great comments and questions. We can continue over drinks. So I'll make 2 or 3 related points, bundling some of the question. You asked this fundamental question about what are the fundamental drivers behind state capture, how can we understand it better, and therefore get to something more concrete as to what needs to be done. Although we have heard a lot of concrete about the case of South Africa, there are many other, not many, but some other very good examples too. Let me just suggest that behind state capture, and I pointed out in the presentation, there is a fundamental issue of acute inequality of influence. Okay, if one starts from that acute inequality of influence, then one can start thinking, okay, who, and I'm doing the diagnosis, who is behind? Who are the most influential and potential captors that are engaged, and of course the why. And that will differ significantly from country to country. But that's one of the reasons Paul's point was so important about the crucial role of civil society, and I will go further, collective action by civil society, get together and so on, because atomized civil society and each NGO and think tank alone has no influence. But when it's much more collective and teams up with the media side, which is not captured, you start thinking about ways of addressing it, which is to counter that acute inequality of influence, which is so pernicious. In terms of very concrete cases, or let me go back to the issue of the actors. This acute inequality of influence can be due to extremely different actors in different settings, and they also vary over time. I would suggest, you would know much better, but listening to you, that the key actors engaged still in state capture may have morphed because of the success in addressing some types of actors at the top of the state and so on. But from my recollection of the work, of your work, and when I came for the Zondo Commission, the whole aspects of organized crime was not very prominent, and the violence not the same in the same type of context. So there is a question also about how state capture morphs in terms of the key actors and this unequal influence. Similarly to your point, in some countries, the object is much more constitutional, others the politics and the parties, and others is more the economic dimension. In others, and the story has not been told yet, we have to wait to, not only to wait, we need to do something, but the US story is fascinating in terms of how, quote unquote, in terms of how broad it is, but it varies significantly. The whole case study of Russia that starts, at least for a few years in the early 90s, attempting to be uncaptured And then first it's the oligarchs, first it's the economic dimension, and then the political dimension takes hold of capture. So over time it changes. I don't think this one generalization can be made, and one has to study every country and address it the way you have done it here. I would only finish by saying, in terms of the moderating factors that can help also playing a role. Civil society, obviously, and the media, absolutely crucial. But it's not only the only one. And there, I take my hat, the profession of Paul and others. In some countries, including, we know what's happening in the US. The judiciary, particularly at the mid-level, the judges, in terms of basically addressing very key issues and challenging some executive orders and so on, play a very important role. The problem with the judiciary, and Paul would know it much better than me, is it takes a long time, and parts of the judiciary may also be subject to some capture and so on, but let's not underestimate. And, and in addition, and this may be controversial, another moderating factor is played by the markets. And we saw it. April 2nd, tariffs are imposed, and enormously. Within a few days, that had to be reversed, because not the stock market, the bond market, the financial markets reacted, and a major crisis was brewing one evening, and they had to reverse, or at least pause the tariffs for 90 days. I don't think we have told and we have studied sufficiently the role that the markets play nowadays in moderating. It affects also the interests of the captors at the end of the day. So let's not underestimate that. And again, markets relates to data and to evidence, and we don't use that enough sometimes. The power of data and exposing these issues and these links as a way of also helping address state capture. But at the end of the day, as you said, and I take my hat off, you have had no absence of that. To the contrary, audacity is crucial.
On that note, I'm going to bring this to an end. Thank you very, very much to the panelists. And I think this has been an important event. I think it's bringing together some of the key players in the Zondo Commission, some of the key players in interrupting, as we now think. I think there's objective data to show that the work that you did, Paul, the work that you did, Ferial, the work that you're doing, there has been an interruption of state capture in South Africa. And I think we should, together with the fact that there's democratic consolidation, that there's serious reform of the state, I think South Africa is showing a trajectory of we should be optimistic in the current situation. So I think you could take a bow in this regard. It's also rare that we've got the person that originated the concept of state capture with us here to give us objective data to provincialize our own understandings of state capture. And I want to end it on this note, which I think is really important, going back to this idea of the inequality of access to power. That the role of the media, the role of civil society, the role of academics help delegitimize illegal and inappropriate and unjust claims on access to power. And I think this is what happened in South Africa, is that those who made a claim on access to power, developing a discourse which drew on some of the best traditions of the anti-apartheid struggle, but for inappropriate and illicit purposes, that language, that narrative that has been called here, was interrupted, and was interrupted by academics, it was interrupted by journalists, it was interrupted by civil society organizations, it was interrupted by think tanks. And I think this is the important lesson to go back. Yes, law enforcement is a key factor. Yes, the judiciary is a key factor, but the role of think tanks, the role of activists in interrupting languages that justify inappropriate and unequal access to political power are absolutely key. And on that note, let's call this to an end. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ferial. Thank you, Zodwa. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all of you. And there are now T20 drinks downstairs. I hope there's still some left. Thank you.